Now, in the past, I've talked about Obama's plot to disrupt the Middle East by essentially pumping arms into the region. And it turns out that the same thing occurred in Ukraine in 2014, just coincidentally the same year that Hunter Biden joined the Ukrainian National Gas Company's board of directors. Now, recently Glenn Beck put out a great piece on the Ukraine scandal, and my differences with Glenn Beck put aside, it was very well done, and some of the dots that he connected come into play for this story. For instance, he talked primarily about the Obama administration sending money to the Ukraine government to bail out the banks of Ukraine, except that money, $1.8 billion, went to Privat Bank, which ended up being nationalized by the government of Ukraine in December of 2016 between Trump's election and his inauguration. And then the money went missing from Privat Bank and was dispersed to 42 shell companies for the exact amount of $1.8 billion. And all of those shell companies were connected to the bank's co-founder, who also has majority ownership in Burisma, Kolomoisky, the same guy Hunter Biden was working for. And Joe Biden and John Kerry lobbied for that money to be sent to Privat Bank. And Kolomoisky is credited in both Ukraine and Russia with bankrolling Ukraine's forces in their war on the Eastern Front. So, while I don't want to regurgitate the entire Blaze TV investigation, I will say that it reliably implies that Obama sent tax dollars to Ukraine to fund $1.8 billion in arms that would serve to make Ukraine a proxy for a US war with Russia. But the story goes even deeper, and Glenn Beck's special didn't touch on this. So, to cover this properly, we have to go back to late 2013 and early 2014, when Ukraine went from a neutralist government to Poroshenko's anti-Russian government. In December of 2013, the late John McCain went and dined with the Ukrainian opposition leaders. And the narrative in Western media is that the people rose up for a revolution, but I think that the best way to visualize this uprising is to compare it to cloud seeding. You cannot create rain in the desert, but in a place where there's already sufficient moisture in the air, you can introduce a bonding agent that induces rain. That's how you can think of this revolution. Dissent already existed. All it took was the bonding agent to topple it all over. Now, that bonding agent requires two components: motivation and capability. The capability was allegedly supplied in Obama's $1.8 billion aid package to Privat Bank. So where's the motivation in the hearts of the people? Well, that's where the CIA's Eric Ciaramella comes in. Now, before I continue down this rabbit hole further, let's back up and take a look at some more evidence of this Obama, CIA, NATO coup. On February 26, 2014, the Foreign Affairs Chief of the EU was informed by her investigator what had sparked the violence in Ukraine. The reason that this is so significant is because it was widely thought that the Ukraine president at the time had ordered the violence, and while we have to consider that the transcript from the February phone call that I'm about to show you from the EU Foreign Affairs Chief and her investigator comes from people within the EU, the information in the transcript is backed up by several other sources and stories that have come out since the time of this phone call. It was well known that Euromaidan leaders all had a dirty past, and Obama and the CIA both favored opposition leader Yatsenyuk, who became the new prime minister. And the transcript, which I'll link below, shows that the EU supported Yatsenyuk, but only to a certain point. And while they were trying to give them loans along with the IMF, the EU seems to have not wanted Ukraine's corruption to continue for the sake of paying back their bondholders. So Russian and European aristocrats were battling over Ukrainian assets, which is why the violence is really to decide if Russia or NATO gets those Ukrainian assets. Now, when the Soviet Union first fell in 1991, Ukraine was a buffer between NATO and Russia, and Ukraine ended up joining NATO's efforts to allegedly keep peace in the Balkans. The NATO-Ukraine Action Plan was adopted in 2002, but it wasn't until August 2008 that the Georgian military launched a NATO-backed offensive to regain control of the region that was disputed with Russia. Russia, of course, intervened militarily, and this was the first sign that NATO, which was heavily influenced by the US, was preparing the region for the coming proxy war. Now, when Yanukovych was elected in 2010, he said that he had no plans to join NATO, but NATO had already infiltrated the Ukrainian armed forces by training senior officers at the NATO Defense College in Rome and in Germany. Now, the new Ukrainian military academy was also full of NATO-backed professors. The same technique was used in the Cold War under Operation Gladio. Now, in early 2014, these paramilitary units were unleashed in Maidan Square in Kiev. Despite legitimate claims of government corruption, the protests quickly turned violent. Armed groups attacked government buildings, and snipers shot both police officers and civilians. They were first tipped off by the fact that these same snipers were targeting both civilians and police officers when the head of doctors for the new coalition said that the bullets killing these people had the same signature for both civilians and the police. This signaled it was not Yanukovych behind everything, but rather someone from the new coalition. In December of 2015, there was an agreement signed between the new Ukrainian government and NATO that promised military cooperation, which integrated the Ukrainian armed forces into the US-led alliance. Now, in early 2019, Ukraine included in its constitution a commitment to officially enter NATO and the EU. This makes it extremely difficult for any politician or party to oppose the alliances while also binding Ukraine to defend NATO and EU allies. Now, part of the reason that Murray Rothbard was so opposed to military alliances is that it ties several uninvolved countries into a single conflict, and that's exactly what's happening here. But the mainstream media in the US and in Europe will not report on this. But now, who funded the snipers? Well, let's go back to CIA's Eric Ciaramella. He worked under John Brennan and Victoria Nuland, who we already know is backing the Yatsenyuk regime, and Ciaramella was Brennan's point man in Ukraine at the time, and he flew to Ukraine several times with Joe Biden. Now, Ciaramella also worked closely with Alexander Vindman, who was the Ukrainian director for the National Security Council, before being ousted from his position and escorted out of the White House just this past Friday. It's partially for this reason that Ciaramella is thought to potentially be the CIA whistleblower that emboldened Democrats who wanted to impeach President Trump. Now, after seeing the Obama administration's involvement in the 2014 coup, and seeing the new coalition's head of doctors say that the snipers were just stoking tensions, which would inevitably strengthen the motivation for people to overthrow the government, and knowing that the origin of those snipers was in CIA and NATO-backed Georgia, it becomes pretty difficult to see Greg Rubini's Twitter thread as anything less than the truth. Ciaramella was the point man in Ukraine for the CIA. Brennan and Victoria Nuland likely hired the snipers, and Obama would have had to authorize it all. And keep in mind, all of the other scandals that have surfaced over the past few years involving Obama, Brennan, and many others. It's no surprise that they were working together on this. Install Poroshenko as the president, Yatsenyuk as the prime minister, and now NATO and the deep state puppets have a stranglehold on Ukraine. And for my own legal protection, I have to say that a lot of this is alleged. I worked to connect the dots here for you, but it's like the $1.8 billion that went to Privat Bank. You can't say 100% that money funded arms for Ukraine, but the dots are all there where that seems like a perfectly reasonable and statistically probable picture to paint. It's the same case here. The dots line up to show a slaughtering in Kyiv backed by both the CIA and Barack Obama that acted as an ignition switch to launch the coup that they were already thoroughly involved with. So that's the story for today. I hope that you learned something here, and I hope this acts as an addendum to the whole Biden scandal. I'm able to continue doing these videos because of the support that I receive on Patreon. So thank you to all of my patrons. And if you're not already, I would ask you to contribute if you can. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.